Alright, picture this. It's 1869, some guys are digging a well behind a barn in upstate New York, and they hit something hard about 3 feet down. They start clearing the dirt away, and what comes up is a stone man, 10 feet tall, naked, twisted like he died mid-agony, turning to stone right there in the ground. Within a day, half the counties lined up to see him, because a lot of folks were dead sure they were looking at proof straight out of the Bible. Thing is, the whole thing was fake, and the guy who built it wasn't even trying to make money at first. He was trying to win an argument. 2 years before any of that, back in 1867, a tobacconist named George Hull is sitting up late with a Methodist preacher, a man named Reverend Henry Turk, and they get into it over the Bible, specifically over a line in Genesis that says there were giants on the earth back in the day. Hull's not a religious man, he's a skeptic through and through, and he can't wrap his head around the fact that a grown, educated man is sitting across from him swearing that verse is literal fact. Not a metaphor, not a story, an actual giant that actually walked the actual earth. Hull argues it, Turk won't budge an inch, and Hull walks away from that conversation genuinely rattled. Not because Turk convinced him of anything, because it hit him just how little real proof anybody actually needs to believe something wild, as long as it fits what they already wanted to be true in the first place. So Hull starts turning an idea over in his head, and it's a mean one, honestly. He figures the fastest way to prove his point isn't to keep arguing scripture with preachers who are never going to budge. It's to hand people exactly the kind of proof they're already primed to believe, and just stand back and watch what they do with it. If he can build something that looks old enough, buried deep enough, discovered by pure accident, people aren't going to need convincing. They're going to convince themselves, every single time. He's not even thinking about money yet. Not really. He's thinking about being able to point at a crowd of true believers standing in a field and say, "See, this is exactly what I was talking about that night." By 1868, Hull's actually doing it. He hires a crew out near Fort Dodge, Iowa, to cut an 11-foot slab of gypsum straight out of the ground. Gypsum's soft enough to carve with hand tools, but hardens up nicely once it's exposed to open air, which makes it just about perfect for what he's got in mind. That massive block gets loaded onto a rail car and hauled all the way to Chicago, where Hull tracks down a sculptor willing to take on a strange, secretive job, and, more importantly, keep his mouth shut about it afterward. Over the next several weeks, that sculptor slowly turns a plain slab of stone into the shape of a man lying flat on his back, arms crossed over his chest, face twisted like he's caught mid-agony, all 3,000 pounds of him. A statue that looks brand new doesn't fool anybody, so the real work is making it look like it's been sitting in the ground since the beginning of recorded time. The sculptor takes needles and punches thousands of tiny pores across the whole surface, one at a time, so it reads like real pitted, weathered skin instead of smooth carved stone. Then they go over the entire thing with sulfuric acid, letting it eat into the sharp edges a chisel always leaves behind. On top of that, they rub in dark stains meant to mimic mineral deposits, the exact kind of discoloration that only builds up after water's been seeping through soil around something for centuries at a time. None of it would survive a real scientist's close inspection. But at this stage, it doesn't need to fool a scientist. It just needs to fool a farmer digging a well. Once the giant's finished, Hull has it shipped by rail out to Cardiff, New York, where his cousin, a farmer named William Stubb Newell, is in on the whole scheme from the start. Late one night, the two of them dig a pit behind Newell's barn and lower the giant in. And here's the part that really tells you how patient Hull actually was. They just leave it there. For almost a full year, no digging it back up early, no rushing the payoff because the money was calling. The entire point was letting the ground settle naturally around it on its own schedule, so that whenever it finally got discovered, there'd be nothing about the dirt or the grass growing back over top of it that looked disturbed, recent or planted. October 16, 1869. Newell hires a couple of local men to dig a well on his property, and he tells them exactly where to start digging, though obviously he never says why that particular spot. It doesn't take long. The shovels hit something solid just a few feet down, and when the men clear the loose dirt away, they're staring straight down at what looks unmistakably like a giant human figure turned to stone, lying flat on its back in the earth. Word does not stay local for long. By that same afternoon, people from clear across the county are already hearing whispers about it. And by nightfall, folks are showing up with lanterns just to stand at the edge of the hole and stare down at him in the dark. Newell doesn't waste a single day. He's got a canvas tent up over that hole almost immediately, and he starts charging 50 cents a head for anyone who wants to walk in and get a good long look. And people pay it. Hundreds of them, every single day, some driving in from towns miles off, just for the chance to see him with their own eyes. A good number of those visitors walk away completely convinced, no doubt at all in their minds, that they just laid eyes on one of the actual biblical giants from Genesis, preserved in solid stone for thousands of years. And then they go home and tell everyone they know the exact same story, and it just keeps spreading further on its own from there. As the crowds keep growing week after week, the scientific community starts weighing in publicly, and opinion splits right down the middle almost immediately. Some genuinely serious people write serious articles treating the giant as a real possibility, an authentic ancient fossil worth studying properly. But then Yale paleontologist Othniel Marsh travels out to see it in person, takes one careful look and doesn't hesitate for a second. He calls it a clumsy fake right there on the spot and points straight at tool marks still clearly visible on the surface, chisel marks that real geological time would have worn perfectly smooth centuries and centuries ago. It's the very first real public crack in the whole story, and it barely slows the paying crowds down at all. The money involved is getting serious now, serious enough that a syndicate of investors, led by a businessman named David Hannum, decides they want in on it. They pay Hull somewhere between $23,000 and $30,000, depending which account of the story you believe, for a majority stake in the giant. That's an absolutely enormous sum of money for 1869, more than most working men would see in a lifetime. Hannum's group moves the entire operation to Syracuse, where the railroads can bring in far bigger city crowds willing to pay even bigger admission prices. And the giant goes from being a curiosity sitting behind one farmer's barn to a full-blown traveling attraction with real investors and real stakes riding on it. And that's when P.T. Barnum, the single most famous showman in the entire country, decides to get involved. Barnum offers Hannum $50,000 to buy the giant outright, or at the very least lease it for his own museum in New York. Hannum turns him down flat, no deal. So Barnum turns around and does something almost admirable in just how shameless it is. He simply has his own carvers build an exact copy from scratch and puts that giant on display in New York City, telling every single paying customer who'll listen that his version is the real one and the one touring around up in Syracuse is the actual fake. Somewhere in the middle of all this, Hannum is supposedly the one who mutters that famous line about there being a sucker born every minute, aimed right at Barnum's own paying customers. The whole mess turns into a genuine national spectacle covered in papers coast to coast. Hannum sues Barnum for publicly calling his giant a fraud, trying to get a court injunction to shut down Barnum's competing exhibit for good. And the judge's actual ruling on it is almost funnier than the hoax itself. He tells Hannum flatly that if he genuinely wants that injunction granted, he'd need to bring the giant itself into the courtroom and have it swear, under oath, to its own personal genuineness, which obviously nobody can do because it is a 10-foot block of carved rock. The whole case basically gets laughed straight out of court, and Barnum walks away without ever technically being found wrong for calling a fake giant exactly what it was. By December 10, 1869, George Hull decides the joke has finally run its full course, and he walks into a newspaper office and lays out the entire scheme to reporters, start to finish, holding nothing back. The Iowa quarry, the Chicago sculptor sworn to secrecy, the needles and the sulfuric acid, the full year spent buried quietly behind his cousin's barn waiting for the ground to settle. Every single piece of it laid out in black and white print in the next morning's papers. And once that confession hits, the paying crowds dry up almost overnight, and the investors who had sunk a small fortune into buying a piece of the giant are left holding an extremely expensive block of carved gypsum and nothing else. On February 2, 1870, a court makes it fully official. Both giants, Hull's original and Barnum's copy standing in New York, are ruled frauds with no scientific or historical value whatsoever. That closes the legal chapter on the whole affair for good, and there's no room left for anybody involved to keep claiming either version is anything other than exactly what Hull built it to be from the very first night he stormed out of that argument with Reverend Turk. A very elaborate, very patient, very expensive practical joke that happened to work better than anyone could have planned. Hull always maintained afterward that his real goal was never the money. He said it plainly, more than once. He wanted to prove just how easily people would swallow a literal reading of old biblical stories without ever once demanding a shred of actual proof first. And in a strange way, the giant ended up outliving the entire point Hull was trying to make with it in the first place. Today, the original Cardiff giant sits on permanent public display at the Farmers Museum in Cooperstown, New York. No longer hidden, no longer a secret buried behind anyone's barn, just sitting there out in the open as one of the single most famous hoaxes in American history. Still pulling people in more than a century and a half later, just for very different reasons than Hull ever intended. Follow Sourbud's Den for more man stuff.